In this lesson, we'll look at three views that allow us to get numeric values from the user, and that's the slider, the stepper, and the switch. The slider provides a bar with a thumb that the user can move back and forth and choose a value between a minimum and a maximum range. As we've seen with the other views, we often use the universal or common XAML properties: height request, width request. It could even do a background color, which would shade this thing sort of a colored rectangle. We can set margins for spacing between the neighbors, and of course give vertical options and horizontal options, also in terms of placement. If we're working with the grid, we have all the grid properties, and we can choose minimum, maximum, height, and width. We can rotate, change opacity, and change scale. And of course, I always put the markup extension for the name at the beginning of the properties. And again, the order is not important here. Some people like to alphabetize these. Some people like to group them so all the font stuff's together. It's really kind of up to you how you want to organize your properties. So as far as view specifics for the slider, the most common ones that I would use would be the maximum and the minimum. So that gives us our range. The minimum is going to be on the left, the maximum is going to be on the right. The current value, and that value will change as we work with the value changed event. We can set the color of the thumb, and you can also set the color of the track both to the left of the thumb, which would be the minimum track color, and to the right, which is the maximum track color. So here you see the minimum is green and the maximum is gray. Let's take a look at some examples of using sliders. So as before, I created an app with some pages that are available through the flyout menu or with the tabs at the bottom. So here are some examples of sliders. The first one shows a value between 0 and 100. The value of the slider is actually double. So what I did here was in the value changed method called mySlider100changed. If we look at the code for that, I'm simply getting the value of the slider and converting it to an integer, and then putting that into a string concatenation that's being showed in the label. In the next one, I added a background color and also set the minimum track color and the maximum track color. That's going to determine the color of the track both to the left of the thumb and to the right of the thumb, as well as changing the thumb color. So you can see the thumb is green, the track to the left is yellow, that's the minimum track, and the track to the right is dark red. Here the slider value I just kept as a double value. And I did something a little bit different here. We'll talk about binding views down the road, but notice I didn't use a value changed event here. Instead, I bound the text of this label to the value of the slider. We'll look at more at that down the road. The next one, again, I set a thumb color of red, height request maximum, set the minimum to 0, the maximum to 100, the value is 0. And on this one, I simply wanted to use this as a percentage from 0% to 100%. And so I did that with the slider %changed method call from value changed. And again, I'm just giving the value of the slider and converting that to an N2, 2 decimals, with a % sign concatenated at the end. On the next one, I used a thumb image source property, and in the resources, I had added a catthumb.png. So that replaces the circle with the cat, and as I slide it, it goes away but comes back. Now that's something that happens on iOS. On the Android side, the cat stays there, but you can see the circle behind it if the cat's too small. So again, a little anomaly in the iOS side versus the Android, but at least the icon does display for the thumb. And on this one, I set a range from -25 to +25, and then again in the value changed, I'm getting the integer value of that. And here's how this looks on the Android side. So we have our slider at the top going from 0 to 100, slider going from 0 to 1, and a percentage from 0 to 100%. And here's our cat as our thumb. It stays in place as I slide on the Android side. So again, there's some difference between Android and iOS in terms of how these are rendered out. I think as time goes by, we'll see a greater consistency between the two different platforms. Next, we have the stepper. The stepper gives us two buttons to decrease and increase a value. Of course, access to all of the universal or common XAML properties that goes across all the views. Ones I mostly use here would be placement ones in terms of height request, width request, and the vertical and horizontal options. There's only a handful of view-specific properties for the stepper, and pretty much we use all of them. We want to have, oops, typo here, should be maximum and minimum. Increment. So how do we want to increment this as we increase and decrease? Maybe you want to increase by 2 each time, so you can set an increment of 2. Then the value and the value changed event. Let's take a look at the use of the stepper. So my first stepper is, I was thinking about creating an app that we can keep track of people coming to a workshop. So how many people walk through the door? We can simply have a little counter here of incrementing or decrementing. And the code for that is very simply, I'm setting the LBL attendees.text to the stepper attendees.value toString. And I set that up as a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 50, an increment of 1. So it's using whole numbers. It's incrementing by integers. But the value of a stepper actually is a double value. So in the second one, for the interest rate, I have a minimum of 0.0 and a maximum of 0.2. My increment is by 1,000th, 1/1000th. My value is 0.83. And I set the text label to 8.3%. I have a method called update interest for the value changed event. And what we're doing here is simply taking the stepper interest.value, converting it to a string, and doing a percentage with 1 decimal. Now the problem with that is if you want to move this by a large margin, so I want to drop it down to, I don't know, 6.9%, I've got to do a whole bunch of clicks to get there. So I redesigned that in the third one here so that I have 2 steppers. One called stepper interest double and one called stepper interest int. We can change the decimal portion by incrementing it. And I can change the integer portion separately. Few less clicks that way. A little more friendly maybe for a user. It does take up a little more space on the screen. The code for that is I'm adding stepper interest int.value plus the stepper interest double.value, converting that to a string, doing a numeric value with 1 decimal, and adding a percentage sign in concatenation. I also want to demonstrate that we can use steppers to change text, even though it's numeric in the background. We can walk through the different class standings from freshman to graduate. And I can also use the stepper to change the size of an image. And the code for both of those is for the first one for the update class standing. I'm giving the integer value of the stepper, but then I've got a string array called standing in which the values are freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and graduate. Remember, the values of the stepper are going from 0 to 4. And so that relates to the different indices of my array. And all I'm doing then is changing the class standing label.text to the index of the standing array. For resizing the flag, I'm going to go and get an integer value between 1 and 5 and multiply that by 50 for the width request and by 33 for the height request of my image, which is named image flag or img flag. Let's take a look at the Android side. Pretty much the same thing. Increment the attendees or decrement them. Change the interest rate. Change the interest rate by the decimal percentage and by the whole number. Walk through the different class standings and change the size of the flag. And that's how we use stepper views. And then we have the switch that allows us to turn something on or off for a Boolean value of either true or false. In this particular little snippet of code, I didn't use any universal or common properties, but again, the standard ones that we use often as far as the placement of horizontal and vertical options, height request, width request. The background color in this case would not have an impact on this one because you're going to set the thumb color and the on color. And of course, we can always disable things by saying the is enabled to false. We can hide things by saying the is visible to false. There's not really specific properties for the switch view. And I use basically all three of them here, which is toggled to either true or false. That sets the value of where that thumb is. The on color, when the color is turned on, and then the thumb color. The event here is toggled. Let's take a look at coding and using the switch. So I had what I thought was a brilliant idea of using a switch to control the increment and the minimum and maximum values of a stepper. And so with the switch, we could increase the decimal portion of the interest rate, and then simply switching over to the 1%, we could increase or decrease the integer value of the interest rate. The problem is it doesn't work on the iOS side, but I'll show you in a minute it does work fine on the Android side, and I have not figured out why that is. But let's take a look at the code. What I did in the code was looking at the value of is toggled for the switch, and then changing the minimum, maximum, increment, and value to a couple of variables that I've set up for interest int and interest double. And if the switch is off, then it's setting that to the double value, and then minimum is 0.0, 0.9, and we're incrementing by 0.1. I actually did a display alert in here to figure out what's going on, and it shows the correct value and the correct increment, but it doesn't work on the iOS side. And of course, I had to do the code for the stepper to increment either interest int or interest double based on whether the switch was toggled or not, and then display the correct result. While we're here, let me show you the last one, which is changing the background color of an image. So in the last example, I'm going to use a switch to turn the background of an image off. So I'm setting the background to either color sky blue or color transparent based on the value of XYZ, which is my switch, whether it's toggled or not. So I'm using a ternary statement there to do that. Could have used an if else. Let's take a look at that example. And so here's the code for that. I just have a switch. I rotated it at -90, set the is toggled to true, and then vertical option center. So it places it between my two labels, inside the vertical stack layout, and then the image is in the horizontal stack layout, and I set the background color to light sky blue, but we can toggle that on or toggle that off. So switches again, just let's go between true and false. Here's the Android side. Now note that here I can increase the decimal portion. I can use my switch and increase or decrease the integer portion. Works fine on Android. And here's turning the background color on or off. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the .NET MAUI Practicum playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos I create, you can click my picture in the top right to subscribe to the channel.